brief introduction of Neoload, and then maybe we just let the conversation be driven by any questions that you have. I will start this by using one word: productivity. So everything about our solution ultimately is going to make the performance engineering practitioner, the load tester, whomever the people are involved in the performance engineering discipline, more productive. We're not changing the game here. We're still doing load testing, but we're going to provide a solution that allows us to minimize the amount of time spent on mundane and manual tasks so that the performance engineer can spend more time on the less mundane tasks, right? We want the tool to be the enabler to become a better performance engineer and not the bottleneck so that we can't get our testing done. Of course, as a load testing tool, we're answering the same kinds of questions that you typically get out of any other tool in our space, whether it's JMeter, Load Runner, SoPerformer, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Understanding how our application is going to perform under load. So as more and more people are interacting with the application, whether it's a fully baked application or an API or a microservice or any endpoint, we want to understand how that endpoint responds and performs as we increase the number of concurrent users. So this graph that you see here, a perfectly viable outcome of a load test, right? As I scale up the number of users, we can look at the performance. A small number here means good performance. A high number means bad performance. And so we can find out breaking points, find out where the application stops to scale successfully, find out what the user load might be that causes a breaking point, or maybe even in a better world, validate that the application stands up to expected load and then we don't have any degradation of performance or of response times. So there are three main components of the Neoload solution. We've got something we call Neoload Web, which is this dashboard. This sits in our cloud in the Tricentis SaaS platform. This is a results engine. It's a licensing server, and it's got a number of APIs and command interfaces that allow us to interact with it from external tools. Like other tools that you probably have used in our space, we've got the main core, the two sort of main core components in terms of scripting and test execution are something we call a controller and a load generator. So the same concept as what you experience with other solutions. If you're a load runner shop, you have VUGen as your scripting engine. Ours is called the controller. JMeter and other tools, of course, they all have some kind of load agent or load injector. We call ours a load generator. I'm going to show you the controller here in a little bit more detail in a few moments. But it's important to understand the flexibility of the solution here in terms of the way that it can actually be set up and installed. So that web dashboard I showed you a couple moments ago, that's going to always sit in our cloud. But these pieces here can be anywhere you want them to be. Controllers can be installed on-prem and private clouds. We at Tricentis can host them for a partner or customer as well. Load generators also can be installed locally within the environment controlled by the customer or by Accenture, or we can host them at Tricentis as well. So it really just depends upon what the customer and or partner's appetite is for on-prem versus cloud, but it also probably depends upon what type of testing we're going to do and where the application is that we're trying to test. But at the end of the day, load generators, like every other load generator in the load testing world, will ultimately drive network traffic against the application that we're testing and measure response time. So it's that response time that we want to validate stays within an expected boundary, within an expected threshold as we throw more and more users against the application. Deployment is very simple as well. So if someone wants to install the controllers and the load generators on-prem, it's just a matter of minutes. You download an installer for our website, run through that installer, and in 5 minutes, you can have infrastructure set up very easily. And if any of you guys want to play around with it, certainly people that might be listening to the recording that don't have any experience yet with Neoload, they can simply download a controller from our website and start to play around with it and see how it kind of works out. This is the controller that I mentioned a couple of moments ago, right? So this is the environment that the performance engineer will have on his or her desktop. As a FYI about licensing, we don't care how many controllers a customer has. Once you own a license from us or on a subscription, you can have as many controllers installed throughout the environment as you wish. So really, anybody that is involved in the performance engineering discipline or conversation, whether it's a full stack engineer or SRE or a load tester or a developer or a DevOps practitioner, everyone can have a copy of Controller on their desktop to be able to do some types of load testing, because of course there's different kinds of load testing one may do. Now, as I mentioned, the core value prop around Neoload is really productivity. That's going to show up here in the conversation in a number of different places. It's going to show up in the scripting. It's going to show up in the ability to get results out of the tool as well. It's going to show up in the ability to automate testing through being able to hook in with other tools as part of a pipeline or a DevOps methodology. But let's talk about scripting, first of all. So an interesting aspect of Neoload is that it is a codeless approach, right? So in other words, you don't actually have to get into a text editor and program. You don't have to write any kind of text-based code or fight a syntax compiler or worry about human error that always happens when you're dealing with text-based approaches. Our scripts are maintained by these nodes that you see on the tree view. So some of you may have experience with a script that looks like this, right? Folks that have used Load Runner know what a Load Runner script might look like. This same exact script is modeled in Neoload with these nodes that you see here on a tree view. So each one of these individual nodes you see corresponds to a protocol request, right? Your typical load testing kinds of constructs, your web URL, open paren, double quote, some query string, like you write in other tools. You just draw it in this approach here that you can see inside of our GUI. So you see we have gets, we have posts, every kind of protocol request that you want to define can be easily created in here. So this means a couple of interesting things for the practitioner. A, the learning curve to be up to speed with Neoload is quite short. If you have a basic understanding of what a protocol request looks like, what a get and a post is, what goes in a header and the like, you can be writing very complex scripts in Neoload in a couple of days. But beyond that, the amount of time one is going to spend creating new scripts, customizing them, and then maintaining existing scripts will be dramatically shorter, will be dramatically less mundane, painful, and manual than other tools. So it's going to save you a ton of time by working in this engine here, all because we're moving away from a text-based code approach. What are the kinds of things that we need to customize typically in a load testing tool? You guys have probably done this before in other tools. We coordinate session IDs. We parameterize form data. We introduce programming logic. It's all going to be done within our engine here with wizards, right-click menus, and other mechanisms that we have through the GUI. So for example, if I have a script that I want to put a condition or a logical action or a loop, it's just a matter of dragging and dropping the appropriate construct to the appropriate place inside of the script. I don't have to type for i equals 1 to whatever. I don't have to worry about begins and ends and semicolons and all that other stuff that typically slows you down in other tools doesn't take place in Neoload. If I want to parameterize form data, maybe I've got some kind of hard-coded information on a post or on a get that I want to make dynamic to make my load testing more realistic. I don't have to declare a variable in text and then substitute the hard-coded value with the variable. Instead, I walk through a couple of wizards, which will allow me to create a new variable of many different shapes and sizes, as you can see, anything from a simple random string to a complex date query or reading data from an external file or a database, anything in between, just a couple of mouse clicks here. And I've got a variable which can very easily be introduced into my code, again, without writing any kind of text. And of course, the hard part of all this is always going to be coordinating session IDs, right? Parameterizing your session information to make it dynamic and realistic based on what the application is returning to us at runtime. And you guys that have done load testing before, this is not unique to Neoload. It's a load testing thing. It's the hardest thing that we do as load testing scripters, but in Neoload, we try to make that significantly easier than with other tools. So if I have a session ID, for example, we've got a wizard that will allow you to walk through a couple of mouse clicks and will build the appropriate regular expression for you automatically, as well as replace the hard-coded value with all the occurrences in my script for you again, with a couple of mouse clicks. So there's no reason for you to go and pour through logs and try to figure out where the response was that contains the value and then write the regex yourself. It's all going to be done for you here automatically. And we can also build this into our recording mechanism. So if you have an application that you're scripting against and there's a session ID or a series of session IDs that are prevalent across many different scripts, you could instead build this rule into something we call a framework to make this more repeatable. And even though we have this concept of a framework, which is essentially a collection of coordination rules that we provide for you for free as part of the install, but it's completely extendable. So if you have that session ID that I just built a couple of moments ago, you could build that rule right into this framework and then apply the framework to a new recording, or have the recorder apply the framework automatically at the end of the recording session, and Neoload will automatically figure out and find all the occurrences of the hard-coded value and replace the values for you automatically, create the variables, declare them automatically. So again, taking a lot of the heavy lifting, the painful aspects out of scripting out of your hands to automate that, to make it significantly easier, but allow you to control it to any level of granularity that you wish. So how do we create scripts in the first place? This is not that much different from other tools. We have a recorder that allow you to create a script by initiating a client, either a mobile device or a browser on a desktop, and we would navigate through my use case. And ultimately, this recorder is going to pick up the traffic being generated by this browser client and turn that into a script on the fly that we can then begin to customize and parameterize as needed. That's one way we could certainly build our test cases. We can also build these nodes by hand. So maybe I want to do some API or component level testing where I have an application or an endpoint that doesn't yet have a GUI, right? So nothing to record from really yet. In that case, I could very easily, with a couple of right-click mouse buttons, introduce a new request into a new script or an existing script, and then customize the server name, the path, the parameters, the HTTP method, and the like, all again through the mechanism here. I could add headers, customize headers, anything very, very quickly. Again, not doing it in a text-based file, not having to go through any of the manual effort that one might have to do with other tools. And if you are using another complementary tool for API functional testing, like a SOAP UI or a Postman, and you have the ability to output those definitions into an open API spec, you could very easily import that JSON file right into Neoload, and we'll automatically build the script for you with all the appropriate calls, all the appropriate parameterization, and the like, as you got defined on that side. So being able to leverage what you've already got on the functional side from an API point of view over into Neoload very easily. And then Danny mentioned some of the other Tricentis tools. We also have integration with Tosca, for example. So Tosca on the functional side, of course, our plugin allows us to kind of convert a Tosca script into a Neoload script. So what we're doing is kind of automating that process I just showed you a couple moments ago. So the plugin that we have actually allows you to launch a Tosca script from Commander directly, but convert it to Neoload. What happens when we do this now is that Tosca is going to drive its functional script as it normally would, as defined on the automation side, run through all the interaction with the browser GUI or the SAP thick client. But at the same time it's doing that, it has also poked Neoload and said, hey, Neoload, I want you to launch the recorder, sniff the network traffic that's being generated by the browser, and capture that into something that I can then use as my performance test, or at least begin to take as a customization step next, and not have to manually record the whole thing. So if you've got a number of assets on the functional side inside of Tosca or Selenium for that matter, we can automate that recording process to at least speed up the aspect and not force the performance engineer to re-record inside of Neoload manually every single time. It also ensures us that we have our load testing scripts in sync from a flow standpoint as to the corresponding ones that we may wish to have modeled or mapped from the functional side. In terms of applications that we can test, it's pretty much across the enterprise. Now, the bulk of our customers are using Neoload to mostly do some kind of HTTP testing, whether it's API or fully baked applications, and it might be Web 2.0 with more advanced protocols, push technologies, and streaming and WebSockets. We can do all that, as you expect, very easily. It's all part of the base license. Nothing extra needs to be stood up or set up. We can also test, or load test, I should say, databases directly through a JDBC connection. We can load test SAP GUI apps, Citrix. We can do some middleware, MQ and RabbitMQ and things of that nature, and some RTE as well. So essentially, we've got the whole enterprise suite covered. And Citrix, I forgot to mention Citrix as well. So we've got essentially all the enterprise covered in terms of the kinds of apps you may be interested in testing with Neoload. Are there any questions about the scripting? Like I say, if anyone is interested that hasn't seen Neoload before, I would encourage them to download the controller from the Tricentis website and record and play around with it yourself. Then it will become really apparent how this thing plays out. I don't want to get into too much detail here today, other than let you understand, or have you understand, scripting in Neoload is going to be significantly more productive, significantly less time consuming than with any other tool that you may have utilized before. You can talk to your Accenture colleagues that have used Neoload already, or the ones that are evaluating it currently. We've got tons of case studies from customers that have moved over from the other tools to Neoload that have experienced this exact same benefit.
Yeah, regarding the scripting, I have a quick question. These correlation rules that you mentioned before, that it's really probably the biggest pain we have when automating some scenarios. You mentioned that we can correlate some variables, and then we can apply these correlation rules when we finish the recording, so that it gets automatic right out of the recording phase. Correct. And is there a way that we can share this setup as a basic starting point
Yes.
environment for our new specialists?
Yeah, actually, once you define,
once we engage them.
Once you get those rules defined, it's very easy for me to export that framework into an XML file, which I could then share with any of my team members, and they can use it across any of the instances of the controller that they have on their own local machines.
Okay. And besides these correlation rules, is there a way that we can share also some test fragments? For example, the authentication section of the script, you have the same authentication for several scenarios. Can you share this fragment of the tip and can reuse?
So we have the ability to integrate the controller with Git or SVN as a central repository. And then I can, from my local controller, push and pull my projects to be able to share with my team members and version and tag and SCM mechanisms and the like. We don't have the ability yet to be able to break out individual pieces of a project at that level of granularity. So what I would encourage someone to do in that case is create a master project that maybe has the authentication module or any other module that you want to share as a master. And then every time I'm about to start a new project, pull that master project down, use that as my new instance, and then record going forward into that project and be able to access the components in that way.
Okay.
Any other questions about some of the scripting aspects?
No, I'm good.
Excellent. So the rest of this, for people that have seen load testing before, the rest of this becomes pretty similar, right? We need to set up the metadata of the test, how long my test will run for, how many VUs, which load generators do I want to include, which scripts. I mean, this doesn't really change. The GUI obviously is different in our controller than with other tools, but it's the same kind of things that we want to set up. What's interesting about Neoload, we've got a couple of extra sort of advantages here. One of which is I don't need to maintain a static infrastructure. So if I want to do sort of old school, keep a bunch of load generators up and running in my data center, that's perfectly acceptable. Customers do that all the time. However, we can also use modern orchestration methodologies, Kubernetes and things of that nature, to be able to create load generators on the fly at test time. So this allows me to conserve resources. I don't have to have all these machines up and running all the time, but it also allows me to run as an organization more tests concurrently. I don't have the challenge that we used to have way back in the old days where I am trying to run a test today, but I can't because my colleague is taking all the load generators and I have to wait till they're done before I can run my test. Instead, we can spin them up dynamically through our Kubernetes approach to be able to make testing far more effective and far more advantageous from a parallel aspect. And to that point, we can even automate the launching of a load test. So again, keeping with that traditional approach, we could always start tests by clicking the go button like any other load testing tool we have. However, we can also be, through the number of APIs and command line interfaces we have, be able to launch a test programmatically through any other mechanism that we might have. So if you want to launch a test from your favorite test management solution or scheduler or a CI/CD tool or anything else that you potentially could kick off a load test from, we can introduce either a command line call, as you can see, very English-like inside of the command line I put here. That can be a build step, or we've got a number of REST APIs that can also be utilized to launch a test to the platform as well. So automating this can be very powerful. If I can use an automation mechanism to launch my test without any manual intervention and use the dynamic infrastructure, again, that allows me to run more tests more often without intervention off hours and all the other benefits that automation provides us as an organization. The results are the same, right? We're still going to launch a load test the same, whether we click the start button or we define it and launch it from an automation mechanism. We're still collecting response times, right? So for every one of the requests that you've got defined inside of your scripts, we're going to measure and save the response time. For any page, for every custom timer, for any node essentially that you've got defined, we're going to save and measure the response times. But the result sets now become very powerful and very easy to understand. Unlike many tools that are out there that require the performance engineer to take a bunch of raw data and dump it into some kind of graphing mechanism and spend a bunch of time analyzing the data, our engine is also very easy, very productive through the drag and drop approach that we talked about, even on the scripting side. It applies to creating graphs and doing my analysis. So for example, maybe I want to understand what happened as I increase the user load during the course of my load test to the response time of a particular transaction or page or request. It's all just a matter of creating these graphs, right? Dragging and dropping into a graph, a set of graphs. I can very easily get to actionable information that might be the output of a load test. I was talking to a prospect this morning who's using another tool right now, JMeter actually in this case, and the guy was telling me it takes him 3 days, a little bit more aggressive, 3 hours to make a report. He takes all the data and crunches it all in Excel and makes tables in Word and ultimately makes a big a Word document that he then emails to his stakeholders. So Neoload, I can very easily just drag and drop, whether it's in the thick client GUI here or inside of the web dashboard that you saw a couple of moments ago, 2 different locations for the same data, but I can just make my dashboards all within here very easily and then share them with the team members that may be interested in understanding what came out of a load test. And again, I can make as many charts and graphs and tables or reports as I need to. At the end of that analysis, if I wanted to share this information with a colleague, I don't need to make a Word document or a PDF. I can very easily just share this link with them and they can go ahead and be able to process the information by clicking right onto them, right onto the link and be able to get at any dashboard that you've built for them. And this could be for data that is being looked at post-test. It could be for data that's being looked at in test that's in progress. Right? So this is a test that I launched with you a couple of moments ago through the CLI. You can see we've got some errors happening and we see the user load and the like. So we can, again, get at information through the dashboard very easily for a test that's already in progress. For a test that was run before, I can very easily do trend analysis over time if I'm interested in understanding how the behavior or how the responsiveness of an API call or a transaction changed over time from test to test or over build to build without having, again, to go into the weeds and doing the analysis manually. I've got a ton of templates that are already built in here that allow me to do more effective analysis as part of my performance engineering activities.
One question here, Steve. So, if I get it right, I can track a specific API or a specific transaction from test to test over time,
Yes.
and we can compare test results.
Yes.
It keeps the historic data regarding transactions, APIs, and stuff
Exactly.
like that.
Every time you run a load test, we keep all the data. The data never goes away until you manually delete it yourself.
And this is true on the Neoload cloud, and could
Yes.
this be true also if you have the on-premise load
Yes.
generator?
Yes.
Okay. So we would have an interface like that on-premise, and we'll track and keep the data on-premise as well if the client chooses.
Yes. So Neoload Web, as I mentioned, typically is consumed by using our SaaS implementation. This can be stood up on premise if the customer has that as a requirement, or since the data is also stored locally here in the controller, we can do the analysis inside of the FIC client instead. It's not quite as pretty and not quite as flexible as what you see in the web dashboard, but the data is still all there for you. And
Okay.
again, we will save the data inside of the result set. Every time you run a test, it's saved until you physically delete it.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. I believe that we're pretty good here, and let's see
Great.
if we can talk soon.
Yeah, looking forward to it. Hope this was helpful and stimulate some Neoload interest. If there's any questions that either you guys have or some of the other folks that might listen to this recording, reach out to Danny, and if we need to jump on another call at some time, happy to answer any questions that people have.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll follow up.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you, Steve,
Thank you very much
for doing this. Thank you,
you,
Guillermo
guys.
and Lucas. You guys have a wonderful day. Bye-bye.